Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Farmers Weekly's webinar. I'm Susie Horn, Farmers Weekly's business editor. I grew up on farms in East and North Yorkshire, where my brothers are arable and sheep farmers. So first of all, thank you to everyone for joining the webinar, and thank you to our experts tonight for their time and advice. Tonight we'll have 5 short presentations on considerations surrounding solar farm developments. There's a good demand for large sites, but also many constraints often. But we've had a lot of interest in this webinar with a lot of advanced questions, so we'll try and handle as many of those as we can. So to introduce our panel, Paul Hewitt is Chief Executive Officer of Belltown Power UK. He leads the company's new projects team in the UK and has been at Belltown since its foundation in 2013. He's got a lot of development and construction experience across all the renewable technologies, well, across wind, solar and hydro. And then we will hear from James Morton, a Senior Associate with Rural Property Consultancy Saunders. He's a chartered surveyor with a strong Warwickshire family farming background. James advises farmers on solar lease agreements, diversification, strategic planning and development, minerals, landlord and tenant matters and compulsory purchase. Guy Parker is a founder and co-director of Witchwood Biodiversity. That's a consultancy. He's been working with land managers in the UK since 2009, promoting biodiversity on private and public land. And this work includes restoring habitats on renewable energy sites, and that can also offer some climate crisis mitigation measures. Rayner is Managing Director of the Ashcombe Estate near Exeter. It's a role he took up after an investment fund career. The estate's very widely diversified, with enterprises ranging from traditional farming at its heart and forestry to an outdoor activity centre and more than 100 holiday cottage beds. The estate's also incorporated alternative energy with biomass and solar power. Peter Harker is a partner with accountant Safri Champness. He specialises in landed estates and farms, but also looks after a mixed portfolio of clients. As well as all the usual audit, accounting and tax compliance requirements, he also covers tax planning, which is where we expect questions after tonight's presentations. So after the presentations, we'll open things up for discussion and put some of your advanced questions and also the ones that we get during the session. So if you have a question, you can ask it at any time, typing it into the box at the foot of your screen, and then I'll direct them to the panel once the discussion begins. The webinar is expected to last for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then afterwards it will be available on demand, and those who've registered will get an email to let them know when the recording is ready for viewing. So we'll go straight to our first speaker, and that's Paul Hewitt of Belltown Power UK. Okay, Paul, over to you now.
Thanks, Susie. Excellent. Yeah, so I'm Paul Hewitt, CEO of Belltown Power UK. So if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the company. So Belltown Power, so we're a professional renewable energy developer. We take renewable energy projects right through from kind of initial site identification to consent, construction, and into operations. So we lease land from farmers and other landowners, and we put all the investment in, and we take all of the risk associated with that. So we as a company, we've delivered over 200 megawatts of capacity across solar and wind. That powers about 75,000 homes and displaces about 130,000 tons of carbon. We're a Bristol-based company. We're small, but we're a kind of highly experienced team. And I guess our pitch would be that we have very strong development values as a small kind of independent business, not a large utility. We're more able than most to be flexible around the kind of competing priorities for land and to try to find solutions that work. If we can pop to the next slide then. So I'll spend most of the time talking about why solar, really. So, I mean, no two landowners obviously are in the same situation. And so the reasons for having solar on your land may vary. And so may the extent of your land that you wish to use for solar, or how and when you want to receive kind of income from it. But in general, solar primarily provides kind of a long-term, stable, inflation-proof lease payments, and those can help make the economics of farms more resilient to changes in crop prices or input costs, and also help to maximize the value of the land. The rents for solar projects, unsurprisingly, depend quite a lot on how financially attractive the project would be. The major factors that affect that are the level of solar irradiance. In general, you can imagine that in the south and close to the coast, there's higher irradiance than elsewhere. The cost of connecting to the electricity network, and that varies significantly across the UK. It can be very localized, with projects only about 5 miles from each other being completely different in value, and also the size of the potential project, and that leads to kind of economies of scale. So there are major things that would change how much rent a project could provide. But in general, rents tend to vary from somewhere between £700 an acre to £1,000 an acre. But I'll admit, for the very best sites that we're looking at now, we're even offering up to kind of £1,200 an acre. So that's the kind of range of possibilities. We as an organisation, so we can bring some of those rents forward if landowners would want that, and that could allow you to get a very large upfront payment in exchange for, say, a lower rent, if that suits the situation better. Might be a better way of releasing capital than selling the land, for example. You retain the ownership of the land, and at the end of the project, the equipment is decommissioned, removed, and the land is reinstated to its original condition. And there's been questions around this, but a bond tends to be put in place that covers the cost of that obligation. So it protects you against the owner of the solar park just walking away. Of course, that should never happen, but that puts the protection in place. You can continue to graze on the land, and sort of small livestock like the sheep shown in the photo there. And then I guess the other thing to note is during the consenting and development stage, we also pay some money. So we pay option fees, tend to be about £50 an acre per year. And our activities, which are basically just environmental surveys, they shouldn't stop you doing anything with your land. You can just continue using it as you otherwise would, and just get paid something for us to have the option to build a solar park on the land if we can get the consent for it. We also pay for reasonable land agent and legal costs, so essentially you shouldn't be out of pocket at all from working with us. There are, of course, a whole load of other wider benefits for other parts of the community. So helping to tackle the climate change, very important. One of the things that drives us. Increased habitat and biodiversity, which we'll hear a bit more about later on, I think. There's potential to create local ownership opportunity. That's something that we're pushing quite a lot on our projects. And also an educational resource. So we've been running the Belltown Power education program since about 2015. And just on the existing sites, we expect to provide site visits and in-classroom activities for over 10,000 children using these sites. So there's various other things that benefits that the solar parks bring with them. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is just a little overview of our general solar development process. It normally takes about 3 to 4 years to go from first contact through to an operational site, and that's pretty much the fastest source of power that you can deliver in the UK. I mean, this is a summary of our process, and it does vary by site, and other developers may have different orders in which they do things, so it's just indicative. But in general, the first step is for landowners to provide us with a letter of authority, and that allows us to make a grid application relating to the land. So the letter of authority, key to note, it doesn't create an exclusivity over the land. It can be withdrawn by the landowner at any point, and so it's beneficial for the landowners to provide a letter of authority to a developer for the maximum area of land possible, even if you don't think you'll eventually want solar across all of that land. Essentially, we can always remove areas from the land that we've got a grid connection for, but we can't add different areas of land afterwards. So we'll tend to ask for a letter of authority for as much land as possible. We'll then make the grid application, and we'll pay for that and take the risk on that. And while we wait for the response from the network company, we'll tend to sign an exclusivity document that does give us 6 months of exclusivity over the land, the land that we agree that we want to develop solar on, and we'll pay a small exclusivity fee. That could be about £10 an acre, so for 100 acres, maybe £1,000 exclusivity fee. All that does is it binds the landowner not to speak to other developers relating to the land, gives us some confidence that we can go out and spend money on the site, and that you're sort of committed to us. We'll then negotiate out the heads of terms for the option, and we'll usually do that with a land agent involved, the commercial terms and so on. We'll cover reasonable land agent fees to do so, usually up to about £1,000 is enough to cover that. And then once the grid offer comes back from the grid connection company and the viability of the site is kind of confirmed, we'll then pay a further exclusivity extension payment of £10 an acre. So same again. And that gives us an extension for a further 6 months. And then during that time, we'll turn the heads of terms into a full legal option to lease. And again, we'll cover the legal fees for doing that. So usually about £5,000 plus VAT should be enough to cover that. When we then enter into the option, we'll start paying the option fees, as I said, about £50 an acre, or we can do upfronting that, £100 an acre upfront, something like that. And then we do all of the consenting work. So we spend all the money. It shouldn't affect your ongoing use of the land. And when we get it consent, we'll at that point execute the option and enter into the lease. And it's only at that point that when we sort of take over the land, we build the solar park. Procurement and construction doesn't take very long for solar, so it's less than a year. And the solar park usually will operate for 30 to 40 years, 40 years now being the standard. And that brings the long-term stable rental income for decades to come. If we pop to the last slide. That's just our contact sign. So we have a dedicated team working on the solar developments. They're ready to deal with any inquiries you might have. You can download this presentation afterwards. Cherry is a farmer's daughter. She's got a very good understanding of the speed of change that farmers are facing, and I'm sure she'll be very happy to speak to anyone who would like to speak to her. Thanks, Lucy. That's all for me.
That's great. Thanks very much. And we will move now from Paul to James Morton of Sworders. Over to you, James.
Susie. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see so many people attending this. Clearly, solar is an up-and-coming subject which is affecting, or hopefully beneficial to a lot of us. Just a brief overview of me. So I come from a farming background, and one where at home we are looking at ways where we can fill the gap left by the loss of BPS and other benefits. And while solar is not an option for us, I'm sure it may be one for some of you that are listening. So my experience in solar has increased over the past 3 years, where I'm receiving more and more calls from clients telling me that they've received a letter from a solar developer who is interested in putting panels on their land. Farmers Weekly have asked me to join this panel today, as I've been involved in several larger scale solar projects on farmland, mainly in the Midlands. I'm hoping to give you an insight into my experiences with those projects and what landowners should be thinking about when considering solar. Whilst this can be an exciting proposition, there are some important considerations, and hopefully myself and the panel can highlight those and address any questions you may have. So we are all aware of the UK's increased reliance on electricity, which has been accelerating following the COVID-19 pandemic. This has resulted in a renewed focus by the government on energy security, and as we're all aware, yesterday saw the release of the energy security strategy with some pretty bold targets, including 95% of Great Britain's electricity set to be low carbon by 2030. Bear in mind that's only 8 years away. With solar now drawing more attention from the government, is becoming a key part of infrastructure, which they see contributing to their climate change targets. As mentioned, the demand for electricity is growing at an alarming rate and is driven by the increase in consumer demand. This in turn is putting more pressure on the grid and those in charge of this, such as the distribution network operators, and ensuring that they make sure that capacity is there for the developers. I was interested to learn that last month a quarter of all cars sold were electric, which this just highlights this need and how we are going to meet that. The government has also announced a rise in the adoption of domestic renewable heating systems through air source heat pumps, and sees this demand being met by energy produced on home soils. Now that nicely leads on to what is happening with the war in Ukraine, which is not only contributing to record-breaking fertilizer costs, but also driving the cost of oil and gas in the UK. The PM has already announced that we are going to diversify away from Russian coal and gas, prompting the need for homegrown energy. This demand could be seen as an opportunity for farmers and landowners to look at solar as a feasible diversification project. However, I do believe there needs to be a balance between energy security and food security. Solar, where appropriate, can be an attractive and sustainable option for the UK, but I'd like to understand the government's view on balancing the need for food and energy. But that's enough about my view, and I thought I would go on to some of the solar lease experience that I've had with my clients and some of the key things that I think landowners should be thinking about. So before progressing with a solar project, I would advise that farmers and landowners consider the following points. Looking at the impacts on the farming enterprise. So specifically looking at how much land is required and can you continue to farm what is left? Will you get paid for land that is severed by the scheme? And also consider how this will impact your agri-environmental schemes and other diversification activities. So taxation, I know that Peter will cover this in more detail later on, but please do speak to your accountant early to understand the tax implications and also how these fit with your farm succession planning. And don't just think about the income. You'll be entering into a long-term relationship with a developer or tenant, and you'll need to ensure that the agreement protects you should complications arise. So think about the retained land, and what happens at the end of the agreement. Also, it's worthwhile remembering that grid is competitive and expensive. You may not be the only landowner that has been approached, and there will ultimately be other developers looking to take up capacity in the grid. Furthermore, the cost of grid will influence the offer on rent, which I believe has already been covered. So once you decide to enter into negotiation with a developer, your agent will be issued with a draft set of heads of terms for both an option and lease. So typically these will include the following, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. So the permitted use, it will say what capacity is being applied for, whether there's battery storage required for load shifting, how much land is required, and you'll need to look at this carefully to understand exactly what is being proposed. So rents, as I've explained earlier, rents are dependent on the cost of connection as well as other costs that are attributed to the developer, and this will influence what you're paid. They've steadily increased over the past couple of years, and following the loss of government tariffs. I'll have to agree that without trying to fix the market, rents are typically between £7,000 and £1,000 per acre, and that's what we're seeing. However, these are very much site specific, and as mentioned, will be driven by costs. So there'll also be some additional payments that you may be offered in the form of option and lease premiums. And then if we go on to the length of the term, so we are typically seeing option periods of between 2 and 3 years with an extension. This is where the developer will go off and try and obtain their planning consent with an eventual long stop of probably 3 years. So next will be the length of the lease, and we're seeing anywhere from 40 to 30 plus years. So you therefore need to be content and understand how this is going to work with your farming enterprise and succession, as well as your tax planning. So maximum capacity, the majority of the schemes that I'm involved with are up to 49 megawatts. However, there are changes in planning policy which could see the size of these developments increase. So we need to allow for that. And then termination, I know that there's been a lot of questions asked about this and what happens at the end of the agreement and who does it favour. So is there a bond in place that will ensure the site will be cleared and you are not left with a solar park on your land? Finally, professional fees, as already been said, these are covered, so that should give you some security and understanding. So finally, I appreciate it's a brief run through, but just taking note, the market for renewable projects is gaining pace with a significant amount of new interest in the market. Solar is an attractive source of diversified income, but care needs to be taken during the negotiation phase. This is a long-term investment, potentially 30 to 40 plus years. How does this tie in with farm succession and tax planning? And remember, factors affecting the chance of success include grid and planning permission. So I would say prepare to invest time to negotiate the best deal. And if you have been approached, now might be the time to speak to your agent or accountant. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you, Susie.
That's great. Thanks very much, James. We've got 5 presentations to get through, so I won't chat to them now. We'll go, but lots to come back to you on there, and some of the questions already refer to a lot of what you've covered. So we'll now go to Guy Parker from Witchwood Biodiversity. Over to you, Guy.
Good afternoon, all. So it's a pleasure to be here. I work at Witchwood Biodiversity, which is an ecological consultancy which specialises really in land management and biodiversity. But we've been working with the solar industry since 2012, so that's for the last 10 years or so. what we've found in that time is that solar farms offer a really good opportunity for biodiversity improvement. The starting point is that you have a secure site, so there's little human disturbance on the solar farm once it's built, and it's surrounded by a fence and security systems. The land is paid for because the panels are doing their job and paying for the land rent, which we've heard about, and that means that the pressure is off to produce from that land. So we may have some sheep grazing and some other things, but really the land is already paid for. And then we're looking at a long lease between 20 and 40 years, which is a great amount of time for habitats to develop and mature. So that's a really good starting point. But then there's the potential to increase the biodiversity value above and beyond that, especially in those open areas and those marginal habitats around the solar farm. So typically on a good solar farm, we can put in ponds and scrapes in those wet corners of fields. We can have pollinator seed mixes. We can have wild bird seed mixes in strips along the edge. We can create wildflower meadows. And we can also produce wild tussock grassland around the edges, typically between the security fence and the boundary hedge. That's a very good habitat to have there. And all those different habitats make for great diversity and good wildlife value. You'll notice these are all common agri-environment options. You've probably done a number of these options on your own farms. So none of this is rocket science. It's really just making sure that those habitats can fit around the operations of the solar farm without causing any problems. So up until now, really what's been driving biodiversity on solar farms is voluntary interest. It's landowners who are particularly keen. It's individuals within solar companies who are interested in wildlife. And it's been corporate standards or policies. Can we have the next slide, please? So this has all changed really a little with the new Environment Act, which has come in this year. And this brings the potential for there being some revenue streams that come in related to biodiversity. I'd like to stress at this point that the government position on these revenue streams with regards to solar is far from clear. So what I'm talking about here is really potential for future revenue. There are two key areas. The first is subsidy payments through the ELM scheme, and the second is the trading of biodiversity credits. So I'm just going to run through those briefly in turn. Next slide, please. So we'll all be becoming familiar with ELMs. There's a section of ELMs called the Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme, which was launched as a pilot in this year. I think about 900 landowners have taken it up so far, and it's designed to improve grassland soil health. So there are payments for different options that range between about 20 and £60 a hectare per year. And at this point, the government is saying that all basic payments eligible farmers would also be eligible for this grassland management subsidy. But the idea is that that would be broadened out in 2024. Now, we don't yet know when this scheme broadens out, whether solar would be eligible, but it would be very suitable for this because the kind of grassland management we're talking about would be ideal for a solar farm. So what are we talking about? Well, the grassland soil standard is really looking to maintain and improve the condition and structure of soil to promote clean water, improve climate resilience, biodiversity, and food production. What that would mean to the landowner is that you would be maintaining winter cover on your land, you'd be adding organic matter, and you'd be looking to diversify the sward, so to go from a pure grass lay to something that's got probably a higher proportion of wildflowers in it. There's also the potential above and beyond this for landowners and farmers to be paid for public goods, so producing things like carbon sequestration, water cycling, pollination. Very difficult to measure these things. It's not quite clear how this might work, but it stands to reason that a well-managed solar farm with a diverse grassland sward would do all these things very well. So I guess we have to watch this space. On to the next slide, please. So the second revenue stream really relates to planning and this new system of biodiversity credits or biodiversity units. You'll probably be aware that all new planning developments must now or will shortly need to meet a 10% minimum net gain for biodiversity. What that means is if your development impacts biodiversity, then you have to replace that biodiversity or that habitat type and then add a minimum of 10%. So you're basically leaving the wildlife situation better than when you started. So there's basically an Excel spreadsheet, a metric called metric 3 that has been designed by Natural England, and all it does is look at your baseline conditions before you start your development project, and then it looks at your plans afterwards. It looks at the habitat types, it looks at the area, it looks at the quality of those habitats, and it compares before and after, and it spits out a number that is a percentage biodiversity change from start to finish. If you get above 10% biodiversity net gain, then it's a thumbs up, and that's all good. Now, for solar, actually, it's commonplace for people to achieve 50 or even 100% diversity net gain at the moment, because your impacts are quite small. Most of your infrastructure is floating above the land, and you've just got some tracks and plinths for the inverters, and the actual piles in the ground take up a very small area. So your impacts are small, and then there's this huge potential to improve biodiversity with ponds and wildflowers and so forth, as we've talked about. That's not the same for all developers. For house builders, they're often very land constrained. They're making a big impact in terms of roads and houses, actually removing habitat. And they often find it very hard to find a 10% gain on their land. There's potential in the future for those with more than 10% net gain to sell those credits above and beyond net gain to somebody who needs them elsewhere. Now, this is seen as a last resort. If a house builder or housing developer who can't find their 10%, they would have to try many different things, but their ultimate option may be to buy credits for biodiversity from somebody else in the marketplace. So we've got no idea of the value of the units or how verification would work at this time, or even if it would apply to solar. But it's important to note that the Environment Act has been designed with this possibility included in the text, and so it's likely to come up in the near future. So all a bit speculative, I'm afraid, but I think the bottom line is, from my perspective, that solar farms can be really good places to increase biodiversity value and also to produce those public goods like pollination and carbon sequestration. And it's possible in the future that some of these may become revenue streams further down the line. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Guy. And we'll go now straight to Rafe Rayner from the Ashcombe Estate. Thanks, Rafe.
Okay. Hi there. Just waiting to see if we're going to see a slide up. Okay, sorry, yes, I've got a very poor internet connection. I'm not, unfortunately, in the UK at the moment. So I'm Rafe Rayner. I run the Ashcombe Estate in Devon, which is a 2,000-acre farming and sporting estate, which has been looked after by my family for 3 generations. In the last 30 years, we've actively diversified, as you've heard, with Outdoor Activity Centre, over 100 holiday cottage beds and cider making, you name it, alongside traditional farming, forestry, residential housing. In the last decade, we've been actively pursuing renewable energy as another string to our bow. And we've done that with biomass and solar PV generation, which we now do with Belltown Power. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this has come to be and how it works from my perspective as the landowner. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the Swarmwell Solar Park was established in 2015. It's approximately 40 acres of panels, and it occupies a site of about 70 acres, and it's on a 26-year lease. There are options, as usual, to renew or reinstate the land, and our payments come as a base rent and also as a production capacity rent. There's also an excellent community benefit fund, which the site's owners, Belltown Power, pays every year, and all these payments are linked to the RPI. So the next slide, please. So making it happen, and this, as you can understand, can be years. This process can take a lot of time. At the very beginning, if there's no grid connection, in other words, no capacity to send more electricity down the power lines, you might have a non-starter. Of course, the lines can be upgraded at some expense sometimes. That isn't my area of expertise. The next stage, and this is the most important, is public relations. As the custodian of the land and the landscape, we're responsible for it, and we're held to account if it doesn't, if something goes wrong or we do something wrong. And it won't matter if there's a developer or a contractor building it. The landowner is usually the one carrying the can. They know who you are, and you're going to get the grief for it. So it's very important to make the case in the initial stages. So I got into the trench and started digging in 2012. And I did a good job. I got all the local area on board. I went many one-on-ones with parish meetings and dialogue with planning officers and local councillors. And my very supportive local MP wanted nothing to do with it whatsoever, because I'm afraid that NIMBYs do exist, and this is an issue that we'll always have to deal with. In fact, it all went very smoothly. And when I went to apply for planning permission, the only problem I had was the very vocal and very punchy sole Ashcombe Parish Councillor who was dead set against it. And this, of course, turned out to be my own father, and it's often the way. However, I did prevail in the end, and planning was granted and the site was constructed by a company called Solstice Renewables during 2015. If I could have the next slide, please. And there's risks. There's risks to building these things. So I could have put my hand in my own pocket and found the £6.5 million needed to build this project. I instead opted to rent the site for about 9 times the value of the FBT rent. But no, there are worse risks. If I have the next slide. So what unfortunately happens, it comes back to public relations. The workers on the site kept following their sat-navs, their big lorries from Lithuania and wherever they came from, to a main B road junction on the road from Exeter to Teignmouth, and stopped in the middle of the road at rush hour, or drove into tiny little lanes going to little villages. So as you can imagine, this caused absolute chaos. And this was despite the estate loaning the building contractors a yard to unload in. And of course, it was picked up by the local papers and ended up with being picked up by the Mail on Sunday, and a huge double-page Mail on Sunday hatchet job fixated on the mother-in-law of Solstice's director. And so it was all rather a bit messy, peddled a lot of rubbish, and from a climate change denying journalist. To be honest, all my friends had a very good laugh, and even the most ardent objectors had to admit that when it was built, they couldn't find it when it was completed. So it was very well hidden. I did briefly change my email signature to Devon Desecrator. You can't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Have the next slide, please. So Belltown bought the site from Solstice when it was completed. And after all the efforts, what have we got to show for it? The answer is a very good recurring revenue. And we don't need to do anything to achieve that either, which is absolutely fantastic. And the community funds generated also go to local school and our own community projects. And the first thing we did was we went on and built a new broadband system, taking our connectivity at home in the whole village and the local area, anything you could see it, from about 1 megabyte or less to 30 megabytes. We've also used these funds to create a new commercial kitchen at our village club and decking areas and all sorts of other projects which benefit the whole community. Can I have the next slide, please? And what's next? Well, we instigated a more accessible information approach at Belltown Power, and so now share monthly data on the power production and the ecological benefits of the solar park, which I think is very important to continue the PR when you've built your solar farm. School visits are fairly common, as you've heard, and there's grazing of sheep. And there's, of course, as you know, lots of birdseed mixes and buffers designed to promote bird life. And the site's blended in really well, making lots of electricity, providing an excellent habitat in and around the site. And the next thing will be the introduction of battery storage, possibly some more panels, which we've started to discuss with Belltown. One of the ideas which is subject to practicality is to see if the local community could be offered some electricity free, perhaps from one of the proposed battery storage containers. And I can see the planners not objecting to anything if we put in something like that. It would go through planning like a knife through butter, I'm sure. Next slide, please. And finally, I'd just like to say that this is all farming. It's just a different kind of production. It's very important work in these uncertain times, particularly when we're looking at farming incomes and for the country's power security. So this is very important work. Thank you very much. That's it from me.
Good, thanks very much, Rafe. And now we'll hear about the finance and tax aspects from Peter Harker of Safri Champness. Are you there, Peter?
Good afternoon, Susie. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Peter Harker. I'm a partner with Saffery Champness. We're a firm of national accountants and tax advisors. I specialise in advising rural businesses, landowners and farmers on their accounting and tax requirements. And I act for a large number of major landowners who have big interests in a variety of renewable energy projects. And I've advised at all points in the life cycle of these projects, from pre-planning all the way through to sale. There's quite a lot to get through today, and I'm aware of the limited time. I'd probably normally spend about 20 or so minutes going through a presentation like this. So excuse me if I don't go into great detail on some of the points, but very happy to take questions as they come, or if people want to contact me afterwards, please feel free. If you want to go to the next slide, Susie. Thank you. That's just me, my contact details. The next slide. Thank you. So one of the first conversations we have with landowners, as James mentioned in his talk, is as soon as they are approached, we hope they do come to us to talk about, is this a good idea or not? And there are quite often opportunities in terms of getting the succession planning right at this stage. We do need to think about, first of all, is this land in the correct ownership? And we need to ask questions along the lines of, where will the income be needed, or the capital receipt? What's the likely length of the project and the value? Who's going to actually run the business, if it's going to be sort of run in hand rather than let out to a developer? But the key point here really is to act sooner rather than later. And if we just move on to the next slide. We've got a very simplified sort of graph here just to illustrate the sort of point of land values increasing as you go through the life cycle of a project. So you would start off with sort of bare agricultural values, and then as soon as a developer starts to show some interest, there's perhaps a small uptick in the overall valuation of the land. But it's not really till you get to signing on the actual deals and plan permissions coming through that the valuations significantly increase. And as a rule of thumb, there are tax costs associated with, or potential tax costs associated with, any change of land ownership. So it's ideally you want to be doing that whilst the values are low, not high. So planning before we get too far down the line is key, and we spend a lot of time talking to clients, hopefully at the earlier stage rather than the latter stage. Next slide, please. Another key question to ask with any renewable energy project is, do you want it to be a trading business or non-trading business? Most of the other presenters today are talking about letting out land to a developer, a solar farm operator, which is a very good and well-established route. However, as soon as the land is let, it changes its character in terms of tax. It becomes a non-trading asset. It's a non-trading business. And you do lose access to a number of valuable tax reliefs. Both income tax, capital gains tax and IHT have more favourable treatment for trading assets. I won't go into all of the details, but generally if we have a trading business, we're in a better position from a tax planning point of view. And I've got clients which have jumped in both directions, some which have found ways of funding they bought the panels themselves and running the business themselves to ensure that they are staying in the right side of the trading camp. Next slide, please. But there are other considerations such as what structure do we want to run this business or own the land through? Is the current not just ownership, but actually business structure right? Should we be looking at partnerships, LLPs, companies? All have different tax profiles, and the details and the right answer is going to differ from individual to individual. We need to talk to clients about their appetite for risks. Of course, if they're going to be running things in hand, referring to my last slide on trading, they need to have a far higher appetite for the risk involved. Also, whenever we're dealing with transactions in land, VAT often rears its ugly head, and we do need to make sure that we are structuring deals in a right way to ensure maximum VAT efficiency. We spend a lot of time also talking to clients about financing these structures. So again, if they are going to perhaps purchase solar panels themselves and borrow, who should be borrowing, which entity should be borrowing, and are we maximising the availability of interest relief? That's all things we need to consider. And then we also encourage clients to make sure that they are modelling their post-tax returns. I think the industry has moved on quite a lot, but certainly a few years ago, we had a lot of clients approached by various people promoting various renewable energy schemes with fantastic sort of payback periods being advertised. And very often when we drill down into the actual models behind this, that it was a pre-tax payback that they're looking at rather than post-tax. Of course, it's the post-tax payback that matters. Profits will be taxed, and we need to take that into account. And people were being sort of promised this to be a 5-6 year payback, and by the time you model in tax, it might be 8 or 9 years, which it doesn't necessarily change the fundamentals as to whether it's a good idea or not, but it's certainly important to manage expectations and conversations with banks, etc. And then if you move on to the final slide, please. Now, in the questions submitted in advance, there were at least 4 or 5 different questions asking various this question in various ways, which is what is the IHT position for solar farms, and particularly what is the availability of agricultural property relief on solar farms. Now, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you a definitive answer today, because the devil is always in the detail. We do need to look at the facts on the ground, and the actual answer is going to turn around that. But happy to talk through some of the principles briefly. When looking at agricultural property relief for solar farms, we're clearly envisaging there being sheep grazing on and around the panels to keep the grass down. And because without any agricultural activity on the land, the availability of APR is going to be a non-starter. Now, where we have land let out to a third-party solar operator, it does become very difficult, because one of the main tests for agricultural property relief is that the land is being primarily occupied for the purposes of agriculture. And where the land isn't primarily being occupied for the purposes of agriculture, but that of a solar farm, it is highly likely that an APR claim could fail. That said, I am aware of claims which have been successful, where the taxpayer has gone to great lengths to sort of carve out the area of the field which is can be grazed, and differentiating that from the land on which the panels are standing, and perhaps where they're too low for the sheep to get under, etc. But I have to say that that's not without its risks of being challenged by HMRC. There are also other criteria we need to look at. There are the other conditions APR, such as the ownership periods, and it's got to be 2 years of ownership, continued ownership, if it is farmed in hand, or 7 years if let. And it does have to be used for agriculture purposes for that full period. So if the agricultural use of the land was disturbed whilst the solar farm was being created, if that's been the 2 years prior to IHT event, death, or settling onto trust or whatever, then again, that might mean that APR is denied. I think it is worth highlighting 2 other points here. First of all, people get very excited about the available agricultural property relief. This only does give relief on the agricultural value of the land, not the overall value of the land. So where there is additional value of the land, be it by the presence of a renewable energy project, or perhaps hope value for planning permission for houses or whatever, APR only covers the agricultural value. A much larger prize often is the availability of BPR, business property relief. And we spend a lot of time working with clients looking at the availability of BPR on their farms and estates. And very often you might have an individual asset which you wouldn't be able to get BPR on its own right, or APR for that matter. But if it is part of a wider trading business, where the overall balance of business activities is a trade still, then BPR, subject to various details, is very often still available. And we do a lot of planning with clients to help ensure that we maximise the availability of BPR, which does give IHT relief on the full market value of the land, not just the agricultural value of the land. So I'm sorry I haven't been able to give a 100% clear-cut answer on that point, but hopefully those comments are helpful. And that's me done. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. And before we go to the questions that we've received in advance of and during the session, just wanted to ask perhaps James and Paul their thoughts on the energy strategy that came out late yesterday in terms of solar in particular. I haven't seen any real detail other than the only sort of numbers I've seen is that the government would like to see the solar capacity increased by 5 times current capacity by 2035. So I just wondered if perhaps Paul first would like to comment on how realistic that is in terms of we don't know if there's going to be any encouragement in terms of support from the government, financial support, and I think maybe we can count that out, but it'd be interesting to hear what you think. But also in terms of the availability of land and the grid capacity to deal with the 5 times growth in just a few years. So perhaps Paul first.
Yeah, of course. I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think it's I mean, the policy itself is a very high level policy, and doesn't, it doesn't lay out any of the details of how it would actually really get achieved. But the by far the biggest constraint on solar deployment in the UK at the moment is grid capacity. So there is quite a lot of available land and suitable land. Planning isn't too much of a restriction on solar in comparison to it being on onshore wind, but grid capacity is by far the biggest constraint. I would go to the extent of saying pretty much all of the grid capacity in the UK, at least in really viable areas for solar, is now taken up. And so the projects that we are developing are sort of based on changes that will be happening to the grid over the next 10 to 15 years. And so we have a very strong ability to analyze grid capacity and analyze where changes will happen, and we can develop projects that are ready for those changes to come into place. And so I think thinking about whether getting up to about 70 gigawatts of solar by 2035 is realistic. I think that all comes down to the way in which the development of the grid changes over that time. But I think it's definitely an ambitious target from that perspective.
Okay, thank you. And James, just Paul said that there's plenty of land available potentially for this. Interesting to hear your take on the policy announcement and also on land availability and at present landowners' appetite for solar.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo everything that you both said, really. It's really good timing for this presentation, obviously, but absolutely, I think planning needs looking at by the government, and also the grid needs assessing. Yes, there is land available, but where is that land going to go? A lot of my clients also have strategic land located around towns and cities. Is the focus going to be turning towards solar now? I mean, in that release, you're right, it wasn't totally clear on solar. It sort of slightly got left out, but we know nuclear sites have been announced and the offshore wind. But I mean, I'm pro solar, but as long as we do think about food security, which is why I mentioned earlier on in my speech. But yeah, definitely. I think some of the DNOs, the distribution network operators, are probably going to be slightly worried because they're going to have more pressure than ever now with this announcement. So it'll be interesting to see, but I think we do need further advice from the government really before we get too excited.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll just go to questions now, and I'll just go over to those, see what's coming during the event. Yeah, so if the first one is, I'll just put it in the priority now. Probably one for Paul. What's the minimum area that's viable for consideration by a developer like Belltown, Paul? Is ground which softens during the winter months useless for this purpose? So if we start with that one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a few people asked sort of around this. So, so the way to think about this is it doesn't cost a huge amount more to develop and get planning for a much larger site than it does for a smaller site. And so, because solar in the UK at the moment is just becoming viable without the subsidies that previously we got for solar. We used to have very high subsidies that made smaller projects viable. And we were building out projects, sort of just a small single-digit megawatt projects. In general, going forward, in order for projects to be viable, most developers are really only looking at very large projects. And as James said, kind of the standard is kind of 49.9 megawatts because there's a planning threshold in England around that. So 49.9 megawatts would translate into roughly 200 acres in total, maybe. But I think the key thing to note is that almost all of our projects now have multiple landowners. We're working with 5, 7, 10 farmers, all for the same scheme. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one landowner needs to have 200 acres in order to have a viable project. A much smaller landholding could be part of a viable project. And with respect to the, I'll admit, with respect to the ground that suffers in the winter months, I think it will depend on how much it softens, but we have built projects in some pretty terrible conditions. So in general, I wouldn't imagine it'd be a terrible constraint.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got so many questions. It's just quite hard to decide which one to put. But this is a good one, and probably one for both Paul and James again. Should solar leases be increasing in value now that electricity prices have doubled? Sorry, you probably don't want to hear that question, Paul, but it's obviously electricity costs and energy costs generally just a big part of the debate at the moment. So but perhaps James first on that one, without putting you too much in the firing line, James.
No, well, I was looking at Paul's face when that question was asked, because obviously, yes. That probably would be a bit of a negotiating position, but and I'm sure Paul will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that it depends on what the wholesale price is going forward. Obviously, what they're selling it to the consumer at the end of the day, we need to see how that then comes down and affects the rent on the ground. I mean, one thing that we do when negotiating, or what we look for, is we look for some kind of turnover rent in the agreement. So essentially, that if capacity is increased on the ground, the farmer will end up with some kind of percentage share of that. That tends to cover that kind of eventuality. We've also got to remember that there could be advances in technology, and if that does happen, we get more efficient panels. We were putting that in for that reason, really, but this has come, this is new, so let's see what happens.
Okay, thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The projects are 40-year projects, and so when we're thinking about the value of a project, we won't think particularly about what the electricity price is right now. We work with some price consultants who do an analysis over what the long-term price is likely to be over the next 40 years, and hopefully the next iterations of those, the price curves will go up, and therefore we'll be able to offer more in value. But I think most price consultants are expecting what we're seeing at the moment to be a relatively short-term spike in the terms of 40 years at least. Maybe a couple of years of higher prices, and then it will drop back to closer to where you would expect the norm to be. But I think James is exactly right. So we indeed offer the rents I talked about were the kind of base rents. We also offer a percentage rent, which is under normal circumstances about the same as the base rent. Doesn't add a huge amount of value, but it basically says if the power price does go up a lot and we are making a lot more revenue from the site than we expected to, well, the landowner gets a share of that and sees an extra bump in the revenue. So that's the normal way that we would deal with that.
Okay, thank you. And I know I asked you, Paul, about size of sites, but we have a lot of questions saying what's the minimum size that you would consider. I know you mentioned 200 acres just now, but forgive me if I missed it, because lots of questions I was looking at. But did you mention a minimum viable size?
Yeah, so I think it depends on so some projects can be a lot smaller if they have what's called a private wire. So if they are directly connected to an off-taker, so there might be a large paper mill or a very large user that the project can be connected to directly, and essentially because that cuts out the cost of transporting electricity through the grid, the project can achieve a much higher price for its electricity than it would do otherwise. And in that situation, smaller projects can be viable, but I'd say that it's there's no hard and fast rule, of course. Obviously, the cost of the grid, the amount of solar irradiation, and so on will all factor into what makes a project viable. But I think we haven't found viable projects under the current in the current environment that are less than about 20 megawatts in size, and so that would be maybe 80 acres of land. It's not that we wouldn't look at projects less than that. It's just that when we look at projects less than that, none of them turn out to be viable because the essentially the cost of developing them is not worth it for the value created by doing so.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And a question for Guy now. Do ponds feature as a biodiversity plan in and around solar parks? I don't know if that's to do with worries over water and electricity mixing, but if you could do that.
Yes. I think the key thing to note here is that ponds are actually great for improving biodiversity value. You're introducing or enhancing, a wet area of grounds. You're going to have wetland plants and so forth, and that's going to attract a whole load of wetland birds and insects and so forth. So it's definitely a good thing to do. And I guess the thing to be wary of is that for most solar farms, one of the planning conditions will be that the land gets returned to its former use. So ponds at the edges of fields is probably much more sensible than right in the middle. From a biodiversity net gain perspective, from that calculator we were talking about earlier, ponds do actually add value to your biodiversity units, but they tend to be very small. So compared to an area of wildflower meadow, the uplift tends to be quite small, but they can certainly be planned into a site.
Okay, thank you. And just to go back to rents again, and it's probably a good idea to clarify this. Someone's asked, are the rents quoted annual rents? Yes, they are. Thank you. And another one for Paul. Can Belltown advise on the insurance position of the work and the liability once the site's up and running? I think probably we need to go to James on that one as well. But Paul, if you could cover that one briefly, then we'll go to the surveyor's view.
Yeah, sure. So under the both the option and the lease, there will be a liability clause under that. We'll take public liability for damage and that sort of thing. We then we will have public liability insurance that covers that and covers any risk to the landowner and the landowner's land. Then in terms of insurance for the site, we will also take out an insurance policy to cover the site. So in case of damage, vandalism, etc., we'll get paid back that. And the rent clauses, so the base rent will continue to be paid anyway, but the revenue rent that James mentioned will also include proceeds from insurance payments due to claims like that. And then finally, as I said, the last bit around reinstatement at the end, sort of insurance to the landowner of the company going bust. I think there was a question earlier about that, about what happens if the company goes bust and that sort of thing. So again, having that bond in place ensures that the land can get fully reinstated, and there's no issues there. But I would note the reality is most developers like ourselves, each project will sit in its own little company. So each solar farm would be X Solar Farm Limited, it'd be a limited liability company, and that company, once you've built the solar farm, is just basically just generating money. Everything in solar and renewables is massive upfront investment and very low operational cost. And so the likelihood of a solar park company where the only thing it does is having the solar park in it going bust is very, very low. And so what that then does is it means that very unlikely that you're ever going to get a situation where the panels just sit there and do nothing. I mean, once the panels are there, they're generating electricity, so it'll always be worth keeping them connected and keeping them going.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, James, I think we're going to come to you on that one as well.
Yeah, again, I think Paul's answered that question quite well. So the only thing I'd add is probably just during the option phase, want to think about crop loss and damage to crops and stuff like that. Developers will cover those costs. Obviously, we try and, when they're undertaking their surveys for the planning, we'll try and ensure that if a developer is coming in, that they're coming in timely periods, such as once the crop's taken off the field, the crop's in stubble. It's a lot easier for them to do all of the surveys they need to do. Another important thing is drainage. So it's thinking about how those panels on those fields are going to affect the drainage. At the end of life of the scheme, drainage should be reinstated, but also, as we know, a lot of drainage schemes run through field by field. So a developer should be ensuring that they are put back to working order during the life of the scheme as well. But everything else he said was spot on.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go to Peter now on a tax question. I know you said in your presentation, Peter, that it's really a case-by-case basis. This is about agricultural property relief on land under solar panels. And the question is about sheep grazing under the panels. So in your experience, Peter, the question is, would that be sufficient for it to continue to be classed as being used for agriculture? You made the distinction that if it's leased out, then the lease probably dictates that that's the primary use. So perhaps you could comment on whether you've seen cases where it's leased out and grazing sheep or some other agricultural use satisfies the relief requirements, and also then perhaps take an owned site where there isn't a lease and you've got some agricultural use. Does the fact that it's not leased out make it any easier to get APR on solar land?
Thanks, Susie. If I take the question the other way around, if I may. So looking at the where you have a site which is not leased out and you are operating that solar farm yourself, it does sort of make it easier to strengthen the argument that that's part of the farming business, and you've got a livestock operation which happens to sort of have some around some solar panels. As soon as there is a agreement in place for the occupation of the entire field or fields for the solar farm, it does sort of change the analysis of it, and I say in most cases I think will likely prevent the availability of APR in your classic solar farm setup. There may be particular sort of I could envisage times where there might be certain areas where the solar farm operator has access to has a lease over a larger area, but there aren't solar panels on a particular part of the field for whatever reason, and that's grazed, so there might be sort of a prorating that you might be able to justify there. But as a sort of rule of thumb, I think once there is once the land is let out, it's going to be quite difficult to access APR. But in hand, then there is a much stronger argument.
Okay, thank you. And another one, which I think probably for both Peter and James, was Peter, you'll have seen valuations on this. What is the land value increase roughly between it being purely agricultural land to land with planning permission for a solar installation? We've got a couple of questions along those lines.
I might pass that one to James if I may, because I'm not a valuer. I could hazard a guess at what I've seen, but it's probably I'm not speaking with market authority in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think it's a good question. I think essentially you might have planning consent, but the developer has obtained that planning consent, and therefore you're probably in lease or going into lease at that point. So I would say you're actually looking at valuing a lease on the ground. There is obviously an increase in value because you're changing the historic use of the land. So that probably does hark back to Peter's advice in the sense that what is that land worth in the future. But to be clear, I don't fully know, but it definitely would have an effect on value. But I would say it would apply to a lease as opposed to an open market value.
Okay, thank you. So we have another one. Paul mentioned grid capacity, and that's obviously was a big constraint even before the government said it wants to increase by 5 times by 2035. First part of this question is, how do I find out if there's grid capacity? And second, we're in the national park, so is it a waste of time even thinking about this?
2 very good questions. So in terms of grid capacity, the distribution network operators, DNOs, or even transmission operators, if the projects are very, very large, are quite opaque. They don't have much good data that is readily available, so it's quite difficult to find out where there is grid capacity. So we have 2 people who are entirely dedicated to trying to find out where there is grid capacity and how that's changing and so on. Anybody can reach out to the network operators and ask them for an estimate of the cost of connecting to the network, and can ask for a conversation with them, but the information they give you is always about 6 months out of date, because it takes them 6 months to receive offers, so receive applications from people, process them, and so on. So I think it's actually a very hard thing to do, is to understand whether there is good capacity in the area or not. And so that's one of the key things that I guess we do as a company. In general, as I said before, in general across the UK, kind of grid capacity is all taken up, and now almost all of the grid capacity that's being offered has a lot of constraints, a lot of upgrade works associated with it. So I think the best, if I'm being honest, the best thing to do to find out if there's grid capacity is to work with an organisation like ourselves who have the capabilities to sort of go and find that out. I can't think of an easy way to do that individually. In terms of the national park question, unfortunately, I think it probably does rule out solar. I know of one example of a large solar farm in an area of outstanding natural beauty. I think there's just one example of that and nothing else. I can't think of any examples of a large solar park in a national park. So I think that probably does rule it out.
Right, thank you. And sorry, a lot of these questions are for Paul. My land's next to a power station and is close to a small town. Are there any particular advantages in being sited like that?
So not really. I would say so. The grid network itself is kind of designed for the capacities around it, for the generators around it, and for the uses around it. And so the fact that you're next to an existing power station doesn't necessarily mean that there will be capacity there to connect into a new solar park. So it's not particularly valuable. I'd also say that I think there was an advanced question I saw around whether it needs to be 33 kilovolt connections or 11 kilovolt connections or that sort of thing. So I would also say that in general, for the sort of size of solar park that we were talking about, that's 20, 30, 40 megawatts, it would have to be at least a 33 kV connection. So 11 kV lines are very unlikely to be able to take it anywhere near the amount of capacity that's needed. That might be able to do 4 or 5 megawatts at best, and those networks are all very saturated. So it probably would need to be larger infrastructure. One key thing to note is that the solar park itself doesn't necessarily have to be at the point of connection. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need an overhead line across your land for it to be viable for solar. Actually, most of the projects that we're developing at the moment are maybe within 5 kilometers of the point of connection, and it's often a connection back to a substation itself. So we'll build a new underground buried line, or maybe even an overhead 132 kilovolt line back to a substation. So just because your land doesn't have electrical infrastructure on it, doesn't necessarily mean it won't work. You just have there's normally electrical infrastructure close enough for us to be able to connect to if there is capacity.
Great, thanks. Probably one for James here, and linked to another one that we've got. can we get capital grant schemes for the land that the panels are on without breaching the agreement? I presume they mean the lease, the solar lease, or would a provision need to be in place for us to pursue something like this? I mean, that brings to mind a bigger question in terms of long-term agreements on land, but not just solar leases, but biodiversity net gain and sort of conservation covenants and that sort of thing. There've been a lot of warnings lately about not getting into the carbon credits biodiversity market too soon because they're very new markets. So can you, as probably working with a lawyer, as a surveyor, protect the landowner's interest in being able to pursue other things on the land if you do sign a solar lease?
Yeah, I think solar needs to be seen as a holistic view on a farm and as part of a diverse farming enterprise now. And I think there does need to be ability within an option and lease to allow for that. I mean, when solar panels are on land, the panels don't go on every square foot of that land. There are areas, triangles of fields that could be available for certain schemes and grants. But also, I think something that Guy might be able to expand on is that, talking about biodiversity, I did read somewhere that there's technology that's coming forward where you can place certain grasses which will grow underneath the panels that irradiate more sunshine from underneath, and there's opportunities to grow different sort of bird and beetle mixes under there. So I think that if the government are going to be pushing farmers, or well, not pushing farmers, but pushing the country to accept more renewable technologies, then they need to allow farmers to use the land that might be wasted by solar for other things. So I can see it working. It's just how it's worked into the agreement and whether developers are happy for us to do that.
Yeah, that's maybe one to come to Guy on as well. Then I can see you're probably wanting to come in on that one, Guy. Do you, when you're working for a developer or for a landowner, do you see agreements that essentially, well, one example I'm thinking of is if a solar developer lease agreement actually entitled that solar developer to also claim the biodiversity credits on that land?
I'm not sure. I haven't seen specific agreements like that, but I think there are definitely discussions happening around the biodiversity credits and who those go to in effect. But I think, picking up on what James was saying, there's an interesting opportunity here with new technology for diversifying within the solar farm. So we all know biodiversity works quite well in certain areas, and grazing can happen. But with new technology, especially with these single-axis trackers, and bifacial panels which allow a fair amount of light through them, what we're finding is that there's a smaller area of shade beneath the solar panels and sometimes bigger gaps between the arrays. And this lends itself more to looking at cropping and various other options. Cropping and agri-solar has become quite popular in parts of Europe and in the US. In the UK, less so. But I think with these new technologies, that opens up that option. And I've even heard of a farmer talking about growing wheat between the rows, between the north-south rows of a single-axis tracker, which I think is rather ambitious. But given the price of wheat and the way things are going, perhaps he's just looking at the opportunities to diversify. So in summary, I think we are going to see people trialing different things. I've seen chamomile grown on solar farms and sunflowers. But as with any small scale operation like that's sort of constrained a little bit by infrastructure, it costs a lot more to manage that kind of land, and you need small kit and compact tractors and so forth, and so it becomes quite specialized, I think.
Actually, that brings to mind another question, which was talking about raising the panels much higher so that we can still produce food. There would still be constraints, obviously, because you've got infrastructure there. But in other countries, I know in Japan, they raise the panels and still produce quite a good level underneath those. Not something we've seen in the UK, but given food security issues, perhaps it might be something that's in the offing? Paul, is that something that would attract Belltown, or just too much hassle?
It's not something that we've looked at in the UK, I'll admit. I think there's definitely a focus on getting, I guess, gigawatts into the ground on the solar side, and what Guy said sort of made sense to me on that front in terms of it being quite a specialist thing. But certainly, as if technologies are developed and proven, and can be and then expanded into kind of commercial scale, then everyone will jump on it if it makes sense, right? I think at the moment, I wouldn't say the conversations we're having are focused around making sure that we can continue to farm the land while the solar is there. So I think that those solutions aren't really there in a viable sense at the moment.
Okay, and another one linked to site suitability. Well, a couple actually. One is about if you have public footpaths on or around the land and the fields of the proposed solar installation. Is that a problem? And another one where there are sewage pipes running under the land, overhead electricity pylons, and it's on a floodplain. Would this rule it out? So I don't know if that's Paul or
yeah,
James.
I can jump in on that very quickly. It will depend. So we'll have to understand exactly what the constraint is and how that will impact it. But it definitely doesn't completely rule it out. We've built a project with a public footpath running right through the middle of it. We had to split the site into two pieces and have the fencing on either side, but that wasn't the problem. In fact, we upgraded that public footpath, and that was a sort of part of the sort of planning benefit that the site came along with. Overhead lines, we built projects with overhead lines through them. Rafe's project has overhead lines running through it, and sewage pipes similarly. The floodplain will depend on how material that is. There'll be detailed analysis that would need to be done to really understand.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a few more coming in from the live event. Just a second. Excuse me. I've got so many questions. Bear with me. Paul, you mentioned biomass. What's the scope for biomass operation? I know we're talking about solar, but we've had a biomass question as well. I think Belltown is involved in that.
I think Rafe mentioned biomass, actually. I'm not sure.
Oh, right, sorry.
Be the right person to...
Right, yeah. And should rents be linked to CPI or RPI? I don't know how those work, but is that something that James you want to...
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Well debated. That's been done because obviously RPI is going to be phasing out. I mean, again, Paul, jump in if you want, but I'm seeing them on CPI. What developers are saying is that because it is being phased out, they're not going to do it. At the end of the day, it's all linked to the rent review process that is negotiated within the lease. So we've just got to see how they perform and see how they go. But it seems to be how hard the developer hits back when we're negotiating on it.
Okay, thank you. And if you're an arable farmer without livestock, how is the land looked after? For example, do you just mow it, or presumably there'd be the opportunity to get someone else's sheep on it? We've also had a question about whether cattle can graze on solar land.
I tried to ask that to a developer once, and they were happy with sheep, but they felt cattle might be a bit big and cause a bit of damage. But I think the developer would take responsibility and hopefully keep it neat and weed free. That kind of thing. It's in their interest anyway to do that. So.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm sorry, I'm being told we're out of time. We've had so many questions, I wasn't looking at the time, but so it just remains to thank everyone for registering for the webinar and for those who attended, and to all our panelists for their time and expertise. Obviously, we could have gone on for quite a bit longer, but we have to finish now. So good night all, and thank you.